So if the State Auditor's Office would come forward and present their report on aquatic land lease rates. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you for taking the time to hear the results of our audit report on aquatic land lease rates. My name is William Wright, a Senior Performance Auditor with the Office of the Washington State Auditor. With me is Carly Schmidt, Staff Auditor and contributor to this report. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the management and staff at the Department of Natural Resources, especially those in the Aquatics Division. They were very accommodating and helpful throughout this process. We conducted this audit because some stakeholders are unsure of how aquatic land lease rates have been determined. We have also heard concerns from stakeholders about potential unfair rates for particular industries or even for the state. A quick overview of our key audit results, and then I'll discuss some background on DNR and aquatic lands. Also, some of these terms will be defined as we go through the presentation. For water-dependent leases, we found that DNR's process supports consistency in lease rates, but limited documentation can hinder its ability to demonstrate this. For aquaculture leases, DNR uses a negotiation process as allowed by law, which means rates can vary. However, written guidance could help foster long-term consistency. For both lease types, we found that better documentation and data would help DNR reduce the risk of inconsistent lease rates. For some background, aquatic lands include tidelands, shorelands, harbor areas, and beds of navigable waters. Washingtonians rely on these aquatic lands for food, commercial enterprises, recreation, and environmental benefits. DNR is the steward of approximately 2.6 million acres of state-owned aquatic lands. DNR is also responsible for leasing out an estimated 40,000 acres of state-owned aquatic lands to businesses, government agencies, and the public. These leases allow historically important industries such as marinas, boating, and shellfish aquaculture to use these lands. The law directs DNR to strive to balance four fundamental public benefits. These are to encourage public use and access of aquatic lands, foster water-dependent uses, which means activities which cannot logically exist in any location but on the water, such as marinas or aquaculture, to ensure environmental protection, and to use renewable resources. Revenue is also considered a benefit, but only when doing so is consistent with the four fundamental benefits I just mentioned. The balancing of all these benefits means that lease rates are one part of a larger leasing process. For example, if marina can accelerate the removal of polluting tires, DNR can agree to longer lease terms in response. State law further guides DNR with different methods to set lease rates depending on the land's use. Water-dependent uses such as marinas and docks have their rents determined by a formula, which will be discussed more later on. Regarding these types of leases, concerns about unfair rates have spurred a number of studies and bills to change the formula over the years. However, due to mixed support and proposed changes and other reasons, none of these efforts have yet succeeded in changing the formula. For the second type, aquaculture leases, such as those used for oyster and clam farming, they have a different method for determining their rent, which is competitive bidding or negotiation. And finally, non-water dependent uses, such as a waterfront restaurant or hotel, uses that don't necessarily need to be on the water, are leased by charging the full market value of the land. In 2022, DNR managed around 1,230 leases, which generated $13.6 million in revenue. Water-dependent leases account for a majority of these leases and generate the most revenue. Aquaculture leases make up less than 10% of all leases and account for about 5% of the revenue. And so for this audit, we focused on aquaculture and water-dependent uses as they are considered favored uses in state law. They're favored because they encourage uses that are beneficial to the public, whereas non-water dependent uses are not considered a public benefit. So because of the concerns I noted earlier, we developed the following questions to help guide our audit. How are lease rates set for state-owned aquatic lands in Washington? Does the process for determining lease rates lead to fair rates for leaseholders and the state? And are there opportunities to improve state law or DNR processes to foster fairer aquatic land lease rates? But before we get into the results, I must point out that we were not able to evaluate whether lease rates themselves were fair because of limited data and documentation, of which Carly will discuss. Instead, we focused on DNR's process, defining fairness as a consistent process for determining rates for similar lease types.
I'll share more detail about our results, starting with rates for water-dependent leases, such as marinas. DNR is required to use a formula set out in statute to determine water-dependent lease rates. This formula multiplies several different factors. A key factor is the county-assessed value of neighboring or upland parcels of land. Other factors include the lease area in acres or feet, a rent adjustment, which discounts the rent in order to encourage water-dependent uses as favored uses in state law, and the rate of return. We identified multiple elements of DNR's process targeted at setting rates consistently using this formula. This includes an optional template to help staff calculate rent, internal policies and procedures, detailed administrative rules, and finally consultations and review by supervisors and management. However, selecting the appropriate upland parcel to use in the formula can introduce some complexity. In many cases, the process is straightforward, as the parcel directly adjacent to the leased area qualifies to be used in the formula. However, in some cases, this parcel does not qualify if, as an example, it's not assessed by the county. This introduces some complexity, as staff must then research various aspects of possible alternative parcels. And DNR sometimes lack documentation to reliably demonstrate that it followed a consistent process for selecting these alternative parcels. While just 2 of the 21 lease files we reviewed lacked this information, DNR staff said that limited documentation can make it difficult for them to understand earlier decisions as they determine future rates. Next, I'll share detailed results about rates for aquaculture leases, such as shellfish farming. State law directs DNR to set aquaculture lease rates through competitive bidding or negotiation. It does not hold DNR to any specific requirements to ensure that lease rates are consistent for similar properties and uses.
Can I get you to hold up? We do have a question.
Sure.
Senator Hasagawa?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Going back to slide 10, I was just wondering, is that 30% discount actually in statute, or how was that determined?
Thank you for the question. Yes, that is specified in statute.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please proceed.
DNR considers many broad factors when determining an aquaculture lease rate. This includes the specific industry, for example, oysters versus clams, location, land quality and productivity, method of production, and other benefits to the state overall, such as protecting native vegetation. While negotiation is inherently less consistent than a formula, it does allow DNR to leverage lease rates to obtain such benefits. DNR had a standardized process for more than half of all aquaculture leases, comprising mussels and Pacific Coast oysters. DNR sets the remaining aquaculture lease rates individually, which means that rates can vary, as do the unique circumstances of each lease. For example, 2 clam leases can have different rent structures and rates depending on factors such as whether they're located on the coast or in Puget Sound and the natural productivity potential of the land. DNR relies on institutional knowledge to foster consistency for those rates it sets individually, but we could not assess the efficacy of this due to limited documentation. For example, some files did not have rent calculation spreadsheets showing the factors that staff considered when setting the rate. And DNR had no written policies, procedures, and guidance specific to determining aquaculture lease rates. Such guidance would help DNR foster consistency in these determinations. Finally, I'll share results that apply to both water-dependent and aquaculture lease rates. We found that better documentation and data would help DNR foster lease rate consistency. For documentation, as discussed earlier, DNR's lease files sometimes lacked essential or helpful elements describing lease rate determinations. Better documentation could help DNR employees access information about current and historical leases more easily and reliably. This would help to ensure that staff determine rates in a manner consistent with other similar leases. And for data, we found that DNR's data system was missing key fields needed to assess consistency, and other information such as lease size was present in the data but not sufficiently complete or accurate. As Bill discussed earlier, this impeded our analysis of lease rates, but it also impedes the agency's ability to do such analysis. Whereas having all necessary information in a centralized data management system would help DNR better assess rate consistency. It would help agency staff draw on historical information as they determine future rates, and it would allow managers to monitor and analyze for consistency. It would also be helpful should the state undertake studies of aquatic land lease rates in the future.
Thank you, Carly. Our recommendations are as follows. For both the water-dependent and aquaculture lease types, we recommend that the Department of Natural Resources develop and implement improved standards for consistent documentation of lease rate determinations, and improve the completeness and reliability of data needed to assess the consistency of lease rates. For just the aquaculture lease types, we recommend that DNR develop and implement policies, procedures, or written guidance documents for determining lease rates. And this concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Do any members have questions? I'm not seeing any come up. Do we have anybody to testify? And we have nobody testifying. So with that, yeah, but they're not on this. So I see Senator Hasagawa has his hand up. Senator Hasagawa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So are these recommendations forwarded to the committees of jurisdiction, or at least the chairs of those committees?
We have shared the recommendations with the Department of Natural Resources, but not the committees you're talking about.
Yeah, legislative committees. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing no other hands pop up. Well, thank you for your report.